Gail's going to have to put the intro in later.
Okay.
So, all right. Thank you for joining us today. With me is John Cameron in the middle and Richard Fields on the other end. Okay, gentlemen, there's a story out here that has tax havens are a good idea. There's a lot of complaints about people not paying taxes or not paying their fair share. But, there's an idea out there that, not paying taxes isn't necessarily a bad thing.
It's our friend, frequent guest on the show, Stephen Greenhut, column in the Orange County Register and elsewhere, where he makes the statistical case that tax havens are actually a benefit to humanity, a benefit to all of us, and the reason why is really at core quite simple. Tax havens make governments be competitive with each other on the efficient delivery of whatever services the people of governments think they need from government. Now, we would argue, of course, that the services delivered by government, in most cases, could be delivered much more efficiently and certainly in a less costly fashion by private enterprise. But assuming that governments have to be competitive with each other, it means that if you live in a high tax jurisdiction, companies and individuals will leave that high tax jurisdiction to set up business or to live in a lower tax jurisdiction, assuming that the benefits are the government services are at least adequate. And the Janet Yellen and the Biden administration have been going on a concerted campaign to equalize taxes across the board. In other words, they want to make sure that all countries have the same high tax burden that the United States does, make it impossible for people to vote with their feet and go elsewhere to lower their taxes. That's a bad thing. And it's a bad thing simply because it makes it possible for governments to have essentially an oligopoly where they don't have to compete, where they can do whatever they darn well please, tax to their heart's content, spend to their heart's content, and people have nowhere to go, nowhere to run, nowhere to flee, no alternatives.
I agree, and we're already seeing it in the United States. Thank goodness for federalism. I think all three of us currently live in the state of California, or as I like to call it, Kafkaornia, and we're seeing companies leaving for Texas and other places where the tax rates are lower, and the net benefit to their employees of being in a lower tax state and a state with a lower regulatory burden is huge. And so we've seen Tesla move, we've seen HP move. We saw Intel, I think it was 15 years ago. I'll have to look up the quote when we next touch on the subject, where the head of Intel at the time, one of the founders, said that we will not add another job in the state of California because they make it impossible to do business here. The tax burden's huge, and the regulatory environment is not favorable to us. And that's and I don't think Intel was actually doing much manufacturing. But they said flat out, California's a problem when we're leaving. And we've done numerous studies or numerous talks on the show about people leaving the state of California in droves. I think state of California had its first ever net reduction in population. And you're seeing there are tons of stories about career bureaucrats, state employees, high-level state employees who are retiring out of the state of California, taking their huge pensions with them because they don't want to be faced with the high California state income tax and local taxes. So, the benefit and the government, people saying people want to pay their fair share. I would say that a fair share would be a straight percentage for everyone, no matter what their wealth. Because if they're getting, let's say you got $1 billion and pay 20% of that in taxes, not carry the knot. What is that? A fifth of $1 billion is $200 million. I should have been able to do that easier. Do you really need, $200 million worth of firefighting and police protection and your contribution to the roads and all the rest of that? No. So it's actually they're paying more than their fair share. I think Richard's made the point that they get lots of corporate welfare, so they should pay more. And in many cases, that's correct. But the downside to tax burdens is that people live in places like Venezuela and Cuba and all these more obvious police states than the one we live in, need somewhere to hide their money from the theft of the local government. You know, like Venezuela with a hyperinflation. You don't want to put your money in a bank in Venezuela and watch it be worth 10% less the next day. You want to put it somewhere where you know it's at least not going to go down in value. So it you know benefits by again, as Richard stated, by forcing governments to compete for services. You know, if you provide bad service in a horrible environment for capital and people, then they should be able to take their capital somewhere else. Absolutely agree. And there really is no downside. If it should force, you know, California still has not admitted it has a problem, despite all the surveys that say it's the, you know, Sacramento. I live in Sacramento. It's the worst city in the country to start and run a business, and I think it's kind of proud of that. But you know, the people who are making it that way need to be punished by watching people flee.
Yeah, well,
you know, you mentioned that it's the large, you know, Intel and large corporations and Tesla and so forth that are leaving the state, but really the biggest corporations or the biggest outflux of the businesses are the small businesses,
Yeah.
who are the biggest employers. And James, you were saying?
oh, it's just this. I actually forget now. I was gonna dive into the next topic, but we were speaking about Venezuela. I know recently over the weekend, or they just reduced their currency by 6 zeros. They just took 6 zeros off the currency because that'll solve the problem. It's to make it simpler, they remove 6 zeros. And we talk about government efficiency. If government was somewhat efficient, maybe, you know, taking a fair share would be you could actually make an argument for people paying more taxes. But they don't. Well, go here and look at the United States Postal Service. Man, am I having trouble talking today. Has now announced that they are going to reduce service and increase costs to solve their problems. I mean, it's a typical government type response is we don't actually solve the problems. We're going to rechange the definition of what service is, and so we can still meet it while charging you more for it. And it's the same thought process of, well, the little guy, the actual customer, can pay more, get less, while the fat cats in the bureaucracy get fed. It's kind of our world is all upside down. What do you guys think?
Well, I mean, it's another example of a government monopoly. And if you really take a look at monopolies, I defy anybody to come up with a monopoly that isn't either run by the government, like the post office as a monopoly, or supported by the government through laws and regulations. Monopolies don't exist in a totally free market. They just don't, because people look at monopoly profits and say, I could compete in that market and make a slightly smaller profit margin and eat the now monopolist's lunch. And that's why monopoly doesn't exist unless it's protected by government or owned by government, in effect. And the post office is a perfect example of that. And what they're doing is absolutely insane. They're saying that they will reduce the time it takes to ship mail from 3 business days to 2 or whatever it was to like 3 or 5, depending on how far it's going. Mainly so that they can use U.S. Postal Service trucks rather than their competitors, FedEx or whatever, airmail services. And they're raising prices substantially at the same time. So, you know, what a great business model. Lower service and increase the price. Can anybody other than a monopoly do that? I don't think so.
No, I absolutely agree, and people don't realize how monopolistic the Postal Service is. It's actually illegal for people to deliver a letter by FedEx or all the rest of that. And the Postal Service has inspectors who can actually go into UPS and FedEx and open up their parcels to make sure that letters aren't being delivered illegally. So it is a true monopoly. And we're actually have the ability to produce this show because of the monopolistic, I guess it's probably Comcast in this area, is required to allow public access on some channels. And in order to get its license to have its monopoly, basically here in the Sacramento area. So I probably shouldn't bite the hand that puts us on the air, but it's a fact, and I agree with Richard that that what the government does is it changes the definition of monopoly to suit its own purposes. Like it's calling Apple a monopoly, despite Apple's minuscule share of internet search and worldwide, other than phones, the number of computers it has. I mean, it's very popular in coffee houses in California, but if you look at Apple's worldwide share of computer devices, it's minuscule. How can it possibly be a monopoly? But
well, even with phones, it has a lot. There are less Apple phones than there are Android phones out there worldwide.
Yeah, and so you can't. Even though I think the most popular phone ever produced was like the iPhone 6. No, it isn't. It's actually third or fourth on the list. There was some Androids and some Nokias and some other things that were top on the list. But despite that, the government says somehow that Apple has a monopoly. And when Apple wanted to raise prices on the books in its bookstore so that authors would be paid more, Amazon brought suit through its government lackeys, saying, "Oh no, Apple's got a monopoly on books," even though Apple's share of book sales was minuscule compared to Amazon's, and forced Apple to lower the price it charged for its books. So how can a higher price be a bad thing for a competitor? Wouldn't it be a good thing? Because people would want to buy books from Amazon. But apparently, Amazon pulls a lot of weight with the government. Anyway, we probably beat this to death. Everybody knows that monopolies don't exist without either government enforcement, government license, or actually if they are government services. And I agree. Yeah.
Well, I worked at a factory that had logistic changes, and so you can actually come up for a tour. You can actually go to your customer and say, "Look, we're making some changes, and so for the next 6 months, 6 months, things are going to be a little shaky. We'll give you a bit of a discount, but so let's expect some problems over the next 3 to 6 months while we're making this change." And that's acceptable. People will accept that. But this notion that we're going to charge you more, give you less, and change the definition of what is acceptable service. We never changed the definition of what acceptable service is. We told people that we were likely not going to be able to reach it for the next few months while we were making this change. And they were able to accept it. Everybody's able to prepare for it. But instead of now, we've got this bizarre notion where we'll just give you less service, make you pay more for it, and we're going to pat ourselves on the back for doing a great job. It's almost, it is laughable.
I'm very upset with the acceptable level of service I'm getting from all government entities I deal with. So they've all been on this USPS model for years and just didn't bother to tell us, where they're doing a worse job and taking more of our money, and sending it off to foreign countries to educate people on stuff that I've never even heard of before. So the post office is just finally admitting what the U.S. and state governments have been doing for years.
Well, unfortunately, they're not admitting. They're saying we want to make the post office profitable. Well, they're not, for the simple reason that when you lower service and increase prices, business goes down, so it becomes a self-perpetuating vicious circle. They're not going to get more profitable. Their excuse is nonsense, and they will continue to fail the same way they have been for the last, 200 years maybe.
Yeah, and we'll move on because we're speaking of failure and the refusal to admit mistakes. Marvin Guy has been sitting in jail for 7 years awaiting trial in Texas for allegedly killing a police officer who was part of a no-knock raid, and the officer may have been shot by a fellow officer And remember, they found no drugs, they found no crime, but yet he's still sitting in jail 7 years later, still awaiting trial.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
just
this is in Texas, which has a castle doctrine defense. The castle doctrine says that you are authorized to use lethal force to repel home invaders. Uh, Police knocking down your front door without identifying themselves, breaking windows to get into your house without identifying themselves, are in fact home invaders. The police are wrong were wrong in doing the home invasion in the first place, and the Marvin Guy was absolutely within his legal rights to shoot back at home invaders. He didn't know they were police. It was 5:30 in the morning. There had been home invasions in the neighborhood in the recent past. He had no idea who was knocking his door down. And as soon as he figured out that it was police, he dropped his gun. He dropped his gun, put his hands up in the air, and surrendered. The only reason the police are not letting this go is because, well, the officer was popular. He was well respected within the police community, at least. And they don't want to admit they did something wrong. That's the problem. And the larger problem, of course, is why do we have no-knock raids to search for drugs? Why do we have drug laws in the first place? Those are the root cause. We legalize drugs, no more no-knock raids, everything. This kind of situation no longer pertains, no longer occurs.
And I was paying attention. I just looked and checked out. California actually has a castle doctrine, but I would challenge anyone to. But I think no knocks have been disallowed in California for quite a while. But if you're peacefully sleeping in your bed at 5:30 in the morning, and someone kicks in your door, and you are living in, let's say, a high crime area, your first assumption, and I think it's a logical one for anyone, is that somebody's trying to break into my house and take my stuff, or shoot my family, or whatever it is, or get even for an imagined slight in this world of dissing that we have. And so, reaching for your perfectly legal weapon and trying to repel borders is perfectly lawful. And again, I agree with Richard. The root causes are, first, no-knock warrants for any reason whatsoever. It's ludicrous. I mean, why? What would be the purpose of a police officer not identifying themselves when they knock on your door? If they have a warrant and permission to search, then they knock on your door and say, "It's the police. We have a warrant. We're coming to search your premises because we think you have illegal drugs." Now, I agree with Richard that what you choose to imbibe or buy or sell should be a personal choice, and not the subject of rules and regulations by the government. So, there's really no legs for this thing to stand on. And there's a lot. It's so murky that the guy could have very well been shot by a police officer. Why wasn't that established? They take all the weapons and fire them. Take the guy's weapon and fire it, and can identify with 99.9% certainty which weapon it came from. Apparently that hasn't been done. So lots and lots and lots of bad things. And let's hope this doesn't happen again, that there is a national furor and that no-knock warrants are made unconstitutional at the national level. That's what I hope.
Yeah, well, no-knock raids is actually a military operation. They're not a policing operation. It's what the military does. And why we're using military tactics for, public policing is bizarre to begin with. And, we add on to all these other things that, that wouldn't happen if we didn't have the drug war and all these other, failures of bureaucracy issues. It's become just yet another long line of our failures. And here goes another long line of our failures. The FISA courts, which are, for those of us who are in the libertarian sense, the whole notion of a FISA court itself is, unconscionable. But the FISA courts have been chock full of problems. More than 400 problems were found with just 29 warrants. And this is on top of the problems that the FISA court has already been exposed for having. What do you think about it, Richard?
Well, I mean, foreign intelligence, whatever it is, the whole FISA court idea was put together with the idea of going after national security risks. And since it's national security, then the court that approves the warrants has to keep everything secret. Well, when you keep everything secret, it gives the FBI or anybody else that's seeking a FISA court warrant a blank check to say, we need a warrant. Our evidence is shoddy. We don't care. The FISA court is handpicked to find people that will automatically just knee-jerk approve pretty much any warrant. And this has been proven. It was another government agency, the Office of, I forget, some federal agency that did the audit. And they are the people. It's another government agency that did the audit and figured out that most of these warrants, the evidence was lacking, or the internal guidelines developed by the FBI to approve the warrant or to ask for the warrant wasn't followed. All kinds of problems with the warrants. I mean, the whole idea of FISA court with knee-jerk reaction to giving warrants is blatantly in violation of the Fourth Amendment against undue search and seizure.
Absolutely. And we saw in the last election the severe abuse for political reasons of the FISA court process, going after, I guess it was Trump's son-in-law, because he'd had dealings with, I guess, the Soviet Union, and basically the FBI agents that put together, that gave information to the FISA court, actually lied. They perjured themselves in order to get the documents through. And it turns out that none of the so-called evidence that they had on the gentleman actually existed. It was, and then, it was paraded across the banner of all the newspapers and all the major lamestream media that, Trump had Russian ties and da-da-da-da-da. Whereas the new guy, what's his name, Biden, his son has ties with foreign governments, and we don't hear anything about that. So, not only is it bad, but it opens the world up for the kind of chicanery that we used to point fingers at foreign countries and say there's corruption, like what they do in the Soviet Union or in China, when they say, we're taking this billionaire and putting him in prison for corruption and taking all of his money. Well, his corruption was that he didn't agree with the party line. And I think we're seeing more and more cases in the United States where that's the reason for a FISA warrant, so that you can put somebody in the crosshairs and get them out of your way.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that we're using the courts are now becoming a tool of politics. It's the next logical stage. If you think politics is, a moral imperative, then you can do whatever you want, right? That's the whole point, and it's the danger. So, but we'll move on here again. A recent study has shown 55% of police killings are misclassified as other causes of death.
This is self-reported police killings. In other words, the police reporting, if an officer is involved in a fatality of a civilian, the police will self-report, and it turns out they're not reporting accurately. 55% of the deaths involved are not recorded as police caused or police inspired or whatever. And again, it's the men in blue covering up for other men in blue and making sure that the publicity that they receive for acting badly, acting in many cases illegally, never comes to light. And this is data that's notoriously hard to come by, because the only way you can get it is by doing a painstaking search on every local police force, every state police force all over the country. The data that we're referring to comes from one of the Carolinas. I think it's North Carolina. And, it just does one state. Is North Carolina measurably better or worse than all the other states? We don't know, but probably it's about the same. We have a very severe situation where First of all, police are asked to do things which they should not be asked to do. They're asked to enforce essentially unenforceable drug laws. They're asked to enforce other victimless crime laws, whether it's vice or whatever, gambling, prostitution, etc. And since they're in a position where they have to enforce, go after behavior that's popular among some element of the public and doesn't hurt anybody directly, they put themselves into a situation where they will get into altercations with members of the public more than they would if they were going after actual crime.
Yeah, and you've got less than 2 minutes, John. So.
No, I agree. And the reporting relies on, in all cases, I mean, there's a standard form. It relies on somebody to ask a question, and the question is asked, what was the cause of this death? So if the word, that this person was shot, if that was the cause of death, it was a shooting. Unless you actually write in the report, there's no default that says, was it police shooting, yes or no, or question or standard reporting. You have to remember to put in, oh, it was shot by a policeman. So if that's not in there, then it's just a standard shooting. If somebody's run off the road in a high-speed chase, unless you write in policeman ran person off road in a high-speed chase, it doesn't show up. So, and I agree that it's the numbers are being finagled by people. And what's really bad is never mind. I was going to go into the racial demographics of it. We don't have time, so maybe we can touch 1 minute closed by somebody else. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, we're talking about a lot today about government and bureaucratic incompetence, but we are not going to be incompetent today. We are going to finish on time. So I want to thank you guys for watching this. I want to thank John and Richard for joining me. And I want to thank everybody else for, I forgot who I was going to thank. But anyway, please remember to love everybody and join us next week. Thank you guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate it.